Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Maximum Downforce, episode 2 of this Formula One podcast for Downforce Radio. Today, we're going to be looking at the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix, which was held last weekend in Imola. Joining me, as always, Jake Sanson and Topher Smith, and joining us this time as well, Chris Kavaney. So, Chris, since you're the new guy here, I'll start with you first. We had a really good race. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of briefness, it was a good race to actually sit down and watch. For the fact that half the track was wet, half the track was dry to begin with, a very spa feel, and most of those races often are exciting one way or another for the fans. Whether it's because of overtakes and such like, I think in general it was a very good race.
And Jake, obviously there was quite a lot of speculation around this Grand Prix, whether it would stay on the calendar for seasons to come. Last year wasn't the most exciting race, but obviously it was saved by the chunk with the safety car towards the end. Do you think it's now earned itself a slot back on the F1 calendar?
It's tough to tell, really. I'm still one of the people that's of the mindset that modern Formula One cars are too long and slightly too wide in order to have sufficient racing there. When you've only got maybe two, possibly at the push, three main overtaking spots on the corner, I'm not sure nostalgia is enough to keep a circuit on the calendar. Because at the moment, obviously, the main drive in Formula One is to make it competitive, make it exciting. I think the weather dealt Imola a very kind hand. I'm not sure if it had been bone dry, the race would have been as interesting. So it's difficult. I think the jury's still out on whether Imola has a permanent place. I mean, obviously, we're in a situation where it's easier to run a race there because of, the difficulties of traveling further afield. But I don't know if it's permanent. I'd love to from a purist's point of view, from an emotional point of view. But logically, I'm not sure it's done enough yet to warrant its place permanently.
And Topher, this is the second Grand Prix we've had of 2021. What do you think was better, Imola and the chaos, or Bahrain and the spectacular racing we were given?
I think I have to agree with everything that Jake just said in that I think Imola was dealt a bit of a kind hand by the weather. We have seen in previous seasons that Imola can be a bit of a processional race. If you think back to 2005, we had that epic battle between Fernando Alonso and Michael Schumacher, and a lot of people calling it epic, calling it one of the best battles we've ever seen, but there weren't any overtakes between them. And I feel as though the weather did help to spice things up in Imola. If it had been a dry race, it might have been a bit more processional. It definitely wouldn't have been as eventful as it had been. In terms of comparing it to the race in Bahrain, I think the Bahrain race was probably better because it was more an actual proper motor race in terms of we had two people really going at it with each other. And we did have Lewis Hamilton mounting his comeback through the field from 9th place to 2nd, which was a great drive by him. Like, he did a really good job in picking off Daniel Ricciardo, Charles Leclerc, Lando Norris, always people to get back onto the podium. I feel as though, I'm going back to your question that you asked Jake about whether it deserves its place on the calendar. Jake mentioned that from a purist point of view, you'd have to say yes, and I do agree with that. But in terms of pure outright ability to race around Imola, the weather certainly helped. And if it was a dry race, I don't think we would have seen as good a motor race.
And obviously it was Max Verstappen who won the Grand Prix in Imola, with Lewis Hamilton second and Lando Norris third. The first British podium, or with multiple Brits on it, since 2012, which is absolutely staggering fact. I really did not expect to be learning that after the Grand Prix. Either way, Charles Leclerc finished fourth with his Ferrari teammate Carlos Sainz Jr. in fifth. Daniel Ricciardo takes another sixth place for McLaren with Pierre Gasly in seventh. Stroll, after a 5-second penalty, was taken back to 8th, with Esteban Ocon and Fernando Alonso 9th and 10th, both of the Alpine scoring points. So that was your top 10. Originally, Kimi Räikkönen was in the top 10, but he was handed a 30-second time penalty for not regaining his position after spinning on the opening lap. So, as I said, it was Verstappen who won the race, and the championship order is now only separated between them by a single point. Chris, do you really feel we've got a proper championship fight on our hands this year?
Yes, we do. But the difference this time is that it's not between two teammates. It's between two different teams. That sort of thing, I believe, is more enticing because it is two teams meaning two different philosophies of how to make a car, especially this year when you consider that the Mercedes and the Red Bull have different rakes. You know, this whole the whole hullabaloo that's going about with these rakes that's been going on, especially Aston Martin have raised something about it. Obviously, it really shows that these two cars are built differently, and the fact that they're largely on track at the same time, they certainly were in Bahrain, it makes it different. You know, in my opinion anyway, I preferred Prost Senna when Prost was at Ferrari because it meant there were two different teams going on that similar vein. You know, it's something different for everybody, and I think, and I'd like to hope that there'll be more people watching this season.
And obviously, like you just said, the viewing figures are definitely up for this season in Formula One. I think it was 1.9 million viewers at last race in Bahrain. So clearly this championship fight really is getting people engaged. But Jake, do you see this continuing on throughout the season, or is either Verstappen or Hamilton just going to eventually start running away with it?
No, I think it's going to be close all the way through. Looking at what we've seen from the practice sessions of the two races so far, I think they genuinely are evenly matched. What I notice about the Mercedes is that without the DAS system that they had to obviously reposition the camber of the wheels with the steering wheel, I think the car is obviously, you know, we all know that the cars from last year are largely unchanged. There's only a few differences in terms of positions of the rake of the aero and whatever. But because the Mercedes last year was built around the DAS system, having to remove it makes it a slightly weaker car all round. And it's certainly something that Hamilton seems to be gaining a bit of an understanding of. Bottas has struggled in the first two races, so that dynamic's there. Red Bull seem to have handled the development better. They haven't changed so much from 2020 to 2021, and we saw that at the end of last year, their car was really coming on strong. So Red Bull actually have the advantage coming into this year, and we've seen that in the first two races. It's up to Hamilton, with his superior skill in many difficult situations, to really take the fight to Verstappen and Red Bull. Verstappen and Red Bull look like they're the stronger package, but Hamilton's excellence is what brings him into the fight. So I genuinely think that we're going to have a massively exciting contest between the two, because Verstappen and Red Bull are trying to run away with it, but Hamilton isn't letting them. And I do think that we're going to see that trend over the course of the season.
Now, Topher, I'm going to ask you this question, and we might even get a bit of a debate started, because I know we were discussing this even before the podcast started. Lewis Hamilton...
I think I know what you're about to ask, but go on.
Well, I think that's pretty obvious. Lewis Hamilton went into the barrier halfway through the race, which was soon followed by Valtteri Bottas, but we'll get onto that in a moment. And he actually managed to get himself unlapped because of the red flag rules. Now, me, you, and Chris were talking about this before recording the podcast, about the different types of problems and pros that brings up. But realistically, do you think that should be allowed in Formula One, where a driver can make such a poor mistake and go into the barrier, yet because of a red flag, just bring themselves back up into position?
It's a little bit of a difficult one to answer with any absolute certainty, because obviously the rule is in place for a reason. The FIA has its reasons for wanting to have that rule where cars can unlap themselves during a red flag period. For me personally, looking at it from more of a sporting point of view rather than from a regulations point of view, Lewis Hamilton, he made the mistake at Tosa. He went off into the barrier, broke his front wing, did well to recover out of the gravel trap and get back to the pit lane to have his front wing replaced, but it put him a lap down in the process, as we all know. The red flag for him was an absolute reprieve, and there's all these conspiracy theorists saying that the red flag only happened because the two Mercedes drivers of Valtteri Bottas and George Russell came together to help Hamilton. That is absolute BS, in my opinion. Absolute rubbish. There is no way that they would come together just to help out one of the other drivers, regardless of whether they're a teammate or not. There's no way that would happen. But the fact still remains that it was a lucky break for Lewis Hamilton. The red flag rules were applied. They were in the pit lane. The lapped cars were able to go out onto the track first, get their lap back, and rejoin the back of the field. And Lewis Hamilton put in his great recovery drive through from ninth to second. And as I said earlier, it was a great drive from Hamilton after the red flag period. But looking at it from a sporting point of view, like I said, I don't think he had any business finishing in second place anyway. And that is for the simple reason that I think that if you have made the mistake and you go a lap down because of it, you should be punished for that mistake. There's been all of this talk in the past about having gravel traps in place to punish mistakes of drivers rather than having a runoff area. So if they go wide, then they're able to just come back onto the track, having only lost maybe a second, if that. Imola does have the gravel traps, which punishes the mistakes, which is what happened with Hamilton going into the barrier. But in the end, that mistake ultimately went unpunished as he was able to get his lap back, put in a drive through the field to take second. I believe he would have finished second anyway behind Verstappen because Verstappen was just that dominant on the route to victory. I don't think anyone was going to stop him. But Hamilton finishing second anyway after the end of that, I just don't really think that should have happened personally. And this isn't me having a go at Lewis Hamilton personally. A lot of people have been saying on social media, oh, people are only saying it's wrong because it's Lewis Hamilton. Everyone thinks he's just lucky. Everyone thinks it's just the car. It's nothing like that for me at all. I would say the exact same thing if it were any of the other 19 drivers on the grid as well. I just don't think that lapped cars should be able to unlap themselves during a red flag period because they just haven't done good enough a job at that moment in the race to stay on the lead lap. That's just my personal opinion. People will argue different ways about that as much as they like. I just think he made the mistake and ultimately the mistake went unpunished. I don't really agree with that.
I am sort of for what happens anyway, because if you were to say, okay, after a red flag that you have been lapped, you're going to stay lapped. Theoretically, you are logging a time on them that they have in so and so minutes and seconds behind their leader to the point that you are lapped. If you're doing that, theoretically, you're timing them. You have to do that for the whole field. And if you do that for the whole field, you are technically using the aggregate system. Because you are saying, okay, this driver was this minutes and this seconds down. You have to do that for everybody. So theoretically, across the whole field, would you not be implying that you'll be using an aggregate system if you want to keep them balanced? Unless they want to do something about the rules where it is, it just applies to the lap cars and anything goes after that, that we return to the normal, people bunch up and race on from there, but just keep lap cars 2 laps. We could do that.
I mean, this comes down to whether the aggregate system is a good one. And I'm personally of the opinion that it isn't. In all honesty, I don't think it is. I mean, we've had situations in the past where, you've had Japan 94, you're in the heat of a championship fight, and the race is won over the 2-part aggregate, but you don't really know. The gap between Hill and Schumacher on the road was a good 30 seconds, but when you come across the line, they're 3.4 seconds apart based on the 2 parts. Now, that is so confusing to the casual motorsport viewer. So confusing. And the thing is, Formula One, yes, it's about great motor racing. Yes, it's about great engineering, but it's about keeping the fan permanently rooted to their seat. Now, you can do technical things on a grand scale in things like Le Mans or in the worlds of supercars or whatever, and GTs, because they're for the hardcore fan. The hardcore fan really appreciate it. They really enjoy it. They like the technical side. Formula One is the pinnacle of the sport. It's entertainment before anything else. And I think that's the thing Liberty Media is getting right. It has to be entertainment first. You look back in the history of Formula One and there have been some brilliant, brilliant races. But at the same time, there have been some drab, awful processions. I was actually watching the German Grand Prix 1994 recently. And they had that accident at the start that wiped out 10 cars in the field and separated the rest of them to the pits with damage. Now, there was so much debris on the circuit. How they didn't red flag it, I have no idea. Well, no, I do have an idea. I have a suspicion that because Berger and Schumacher, the 2 German-speaking drivers in the field, were a country mile ahead of everybody else, and the Williams team were in bits in the pit lane, they decided, no, we've got a chance for Schumacher to win the German Grand Prix. Let's let him keep out there. And it completely backfired. By the end of lap 21, Schumacher was out and there were only 8 cars running by that point. So the next, 24 laps were an absolute snorefest. So I think you have to balance the show with great racing. And I'm personally of the opinion that allowing people to unlap themselves under a red flag conditions and come back onto the lead lap. It's how you keep people interested. It's how you reset the race, and it's how you get the show to be more interesting. Because then people have that, well, can Hamilton come through the field? If you take that away at the red flag, then a massive portion of the fan base will go, oh, well, Verstappen's already won it. It can't be caught. So the fact that you've now added that dynamic, that storyline into the race, hooks people in. It keeps people interested. So I do think there's a balancing act. You need to have that sort of spice up of the show, if you will. I think that is important now.
Equally, I'd like to say, you mentioned it, I think, Topher. Are we bringing this up just because it's Lewis Hamilton charging through the field? If it was the other way around, when Lewis Hamilton's leading the race, and Verstappen was the one in second, and Verstappen was the one that went off and hit his wing a little bit, went a lap down, then the red flag happens, then he charges through the field and gets second place. Would we be having this conversation right now? Would we? Seriously?
I think you raised quite an interesting point there, Chris, because I think that basically saying, should we race it because it's Lewis Hamilton or Max Verstappen or whoever, Lewis Hamilton is certainly the most high-profile racing driver in Formula One at the moment. You know, he's the new statistical greatest driver of all time. He's equaled Schumacher's championship records. He's bettered his wins record. Would it be the same argument if it was, say, I don't know, Carlos Sainz, for example, or Lance Stroll or whoever? I think you do raise a very interesting point there. Would we be having the same conversation if it was someone else? I think the best way that I can answer that is we should be having the same argument. I think because Lewis Hamilton is a lot more high profile, obviously he's going to be making the headlines a lot more than other drivers would. Thus, it becomes there becomes more attention on social media, for example. If it was someone who was more low profile, not that I want to belittle a driver by saying a low profile, but a lesser profile than Hamilton, we might not be having the exact same conversation, but I think we definitely should be having the same conversation. I think that's probably the best way I can answer
what
that.
other drivers were that benefited? I think Pierre Gasly was one that benefited from the unlapping himself, right? Because where did he finish again? Pierre Gasly, he finished
seventh in the end, so he was able to recover from his position and make up places.
And with Pierre Gasly, they had the strategic error from AlphaTauri early on because they put him onto the full wet tyres at the start, whereas most of the rest of the field went for intermediates. And if I was to include the same argument for him as I had for Hamilton, AlphaTauri got it wrong, Gasly got it wrong. Whoever made that call to put him onto the full wets, it was the wrong call, ultimately. And he should be paying the penalty for that, which he did at the start of the race. He started losing a lot of positions. He fell outside of the points. And as you guys said, he ended up benefiting from the red flag period and being able to unlap himself. Is that right? Is that not? That's something that we could contest, until the cows come home. It's one of those things I think is going to rumble on for quite a long time in Formula One. Is it right to allow cars to unlap themselves during a red flag? I mean, you need to look at the whole picture here, and I think Jake made a very good point in saying that it's about the spectacle of Formula One as well. We want to keep it exciting for the fans, and the example of the 1994 German Grand Prix, that's a very good analogy there, because we had the powers that be thinking that they were doing a good thing and trying to get Schumacher a win at the German Grand Prix, if that was the actual reason. That's neither here nor there. But then ultimately it went on to be a ball fest. Could the same thing have happened in Imola this time around if they hadn't done that themselves? There's so many different variables at play here. I think it's very difficult to put an exact answer on it. I think the best thing that I can say for now is it's happened. We had a very enjoyable race. Hamilton did put in a great recovery drive to go from 9th to 2nd. We did enjoy watching that. Him chasing down Leclerc, Norris to get on the podium. And would we have the same show if they weren't able to unlap themselves? Maybe not. I don't know.
As well as Hamilton, it wasn't only him who struggled as a driver in the grid. It was also Sergio Perez had a very poor day after an amazing qualifying on Saturday. His first ever front row start in Formula One, finishing second just behind Lewis Hamilton. Yet in the race, let's face it, he was absolutely nowhere. He had an incident where he overtook under safety car, got himself a very harsh penalty, and then towards the end of the race as well, he spun. And considering yesterday he outmatched Verstappen in terms of his quali pace, he just wasn't able to match Verstappen during the Grand Prix. Jake, is there really some form of curse at this Red Bull seat, or do you think it's just been an unlucky couple of races for Sergio Perez?
I think the latter. I think it's been an unlucky couple of races for Sergio. He's proven his speed in the first two races. I mean, he outqualified Max on Saturday, so I don't think you can say he's doing a bad job. You got to remember that there are two interesting factors here about Sergio Perez that played against him at Imola. One, the weather, because it was not wet and it was not dry. It's halfway between. And that is the worst case scenario for a racing driver in Formula One. You want it to be bone dry or you want it to be monsoon wet. Anywhere in between, it's a nightmare because the intermediates don't get to temperature the way they should because there's not enough water to go through the treads to bite. And you've got that never-ending saga of when do you go slicks, when do you go slicks? And you've just got to blink and hope that somebody takes the gamble for you. And then you can benefit from it. Or you have to be the person who makes that gamble. Sergio didn't benefit from it on this occasion because he just got caught out in the conditions. And it's quite easy for drivers to get caught out in these conditions. But my second argument about that, the second point, is that there are some people who adapt to those conditions really, really well in changeable. And I think it actually comes down to their karting days. Because every single driver on the current Formula One grid has had a go in European karting up to a decent level, except for one. And that's Sergio Perez. He did all his karting in North America. Where it's very, very tricky to get that same level of competition, of intensity, and the weather conditions to be so changeable. So I think, he's very, very good in the wet because, as we know, in North America, when it rains, it really rains. But it's very hard to get that sort of blend of conditions in between that we see constantly in Belgium, in Italy, in the Netherlands, in Portugal, and Turkey, like we saw last year. So I think Perez actually doesn't have the same advantage that other drivers have of the changeable conditions. It's either bone dry or wet from Sergio Perez's karting days. So he has to kind of adapt to the situation as best as possible. We saw that as well with Felipe Massa a few times. Again, that sort of South American driver making their way through. If you don't go to Europe early, you don't learn to adapt to the impossible conditions of running on the wets on slick tyres as a kart racer. And that's how you learn to adapt to the fine distance between bone dry and slightly muggy that makes you a phenomenal Grand Prix driver. Hamilton's got that. Verstappen has got that. Leclerc has got that. Norris has got that because they came through the European karting scene. But Perez didn't. And that's the only chink in his armor, if you like. That's the only weak spot he seems to have in changeable conditions. So I think it is not so much about Sergio getting it wrong, more that his instincts didn't prepare him for the difficulties in the change of conditions, whereas a few of the other drivers on the grid were able to adapt to that in a better manner because of their upbringing in the sport.
I think that goes to show just how important karting is to people who reach Formula One, and especially from such an early age as well. Some people start even from as early as 4 years old. This is a point in your life where you're starting to develop muscle memory. You're learning about the way that the world works, and in this particular instance, about the way that karting and motorsports in general works. And as Jake just said, Sergio Perez, he didn't really have the advantage, for lack of a better word. He didn't really have the advantage of learning in Europe, where you can get those changeable weather conditions. And as we see in America, it's usually one extreme or the other.
Yeah. Well, if you look at all of the drivers who did a good job at Imola, all of them had strong FIA karting campaigns. All of them. I mean, Bottas really struggled. He only did 1 or 2 races in FIA karting at that level. Russell was a double junior European champion. He was all over Bottas before they had the incident. You can look through the entirety of the field and come up with names. Gasly had a difficult day, but he came back strong. He came back to the points. Again, so strong in European karting. Danny Rick was not on the same level of pace as Lando Norris. Why? It comes back to exactly the same thing. He didn't have as many opportunities to have that run in changeable conditions that Lando did in European karting. It's so important. It's so relevant. And I think people really misinterpret just how important karting is to being a great Formula One driver, especially with the current rule set that they're in, where the driver really does make a massive, massive difference in terms of traction, in terms of acceleration out of corners, and in terms of confidence in the car. Their karting route is so important these days. And it's only now that we're really starting to see that but it's a point that not many people are able to make because karting as a sport has been negated so often and kind of said, well, it's just for kids. It's not just for kids. It's such an important training tool. It's why we see people like Vettel, like Russell, like Grosjean in years gone by going back to it as a training tool. It's such an important skill.
See, a lot of people will think that karting is just where you learn how to race, and then the junior formulae, so Formula 4, Formula BMW, so on, so on, so on, that's where you truly learn how to be a race driver. But as Jake has quite rightly alluded to, karting is where you properly learn it. But as I said earlier, it's about where you learn your muscle memory. It's about where you learn how motorsport in general works. If you don't really have a good pedigree in karting, you're probably not going to ever make it to Formula 1 or any other top flight championship in the world. And yeah, it's really important to be able to have that under your belt, to have that experience. And as Jake has pointed out, if you don't really have that experience in karting of managing changeable conditions, going from slicks to wets and then wets to slicks and then maybe back to wets again, you're not really going to have the full package, if you like. Sergio Perez, as we're talking about, he is a very accomplished racing driver. He had an absolutely stellar junior career coming up through the ladder, and he's now a Grand Prix winner in Formula 1. But when it comes down to the area of his game where he hasn't learnt how to do it in the same way that other people have, it shows. Even in Formula 1, where this is supposed to be the 20 best drivers in the world, no driver is absolutely perfect. They are going to have chinks in the armour, and this particular weekend at Imola, Sergio's chink was shown quite heavily as well.
Yeah, I mean, to give you an analogy about Sergio, just to finish off the point about Sergio, his skill in Formula 1 is unquestionable. He is one of the best drivers out there. There's no question about it. But because of the deficiencies of his education to come into Formula 1, he has been able to bring strength to the sport that he shouldn't have been able to. He is the most successful Mexican in Formula 1 for 50 years, in the days when that kind of acumen wasn't really needed. You could just be a pure natural talent and cope with it. Now it's so difficult for a driver from Mexico to come through and be strong in Formula 1. He is so far ahead of anybody else in terms of their national status. The comparison I would make is if he went to IndyCar right now, he would dominate it. He would absolutely blitz it. He's at that level where I think if you put him in a Penske, or you put him in a Rahal Letterman, or you put him in a Chip Ganassi, he would romp to the title. Absolutely blitz it. He would win half the races in the year without any question at all.
That is a scenario that could actually have played out for this season had he not been offered a seat with Red Bull.
Absolutely. So, I love the fact that he's in Formula 1. I think he deserves to be in Formula 1. It's where his passion lies. It's where he wants to be. But he is at that skill level where he is punching massively above the potential weight he could have shown. And he's been doing it for years. He really is one of the most intellectually gifted drivers on the grid. He deserves his place. I think he will win races this year. I just think the first two races have been unfortunate to him.
Well, don't forget, it is only the first two races of the season. It's still early to draw any real conclusion as to where he's going to be at this season. I completely agree with you, Jake. I think he will win races this season. I'm not going to put a number on how many he will win, but it will be at least one. I'm certain of that. He's too good to not win races, basically.
What I will say on this, his fastest lap at this race weekend was 1.6 seconds slower than Max Verstappen.
Yeah, but that's just only one race weekend, isn't it? I mean, if we go to the next race in Portugal, he could absolutely dominate Max there.
You say that, at Bahrain, he was 0.7 seconds slower.
Well, if he's now if he's 1.6 behind, that's progress by a tenth.
It's not. No, it's not.
It is a good question. It is a good point that Chris makes, because he's definitely on the back foot, and I feel this is a character building moment for Sergio. He needs to prove that Red Bull were right to take him, and I think the next three races in particular are critical, because we know more than any other team out there how cutthroat Red Bull are. If they don't like a driver, they will cut him. It's as simple as that. I mean, Kvyat, he did one bad race and they said, right, that's it, we're bringing in Max. So they are ridiculously cutthroat. So Sergio's under pressure. There's no question about that. He's got to prove, probably in the next three races, that he was worthy of the decision. So it is a tense time for him, but I think he can pull through. I think he can make it.
We did see the flash of brilliance from him in qualifying, so the speed is there. But the race pace, I think that's what he needs to work on at the moment. And As you said, Jake, next three races, I think, will be critical for that. We're just going to have to see how that plays out, whether he can get on top of the car and get a bit closer to Max.
I'll say this as well. So I said he was 0.7 seconds slower at Bahrain. He's 1.6 slower in Imola, so he's got worse.
Oh, sorry, I misheard that. Yeah, okay, I retract that joke then. But yeah, so I think it is still too early to draw any real conclusions. We're only 2 races into the season. The speed is clearly there for Sergio, as he puts it, on the front row in Imola. Yeah, he just needs to work on his race pace now. And when we go to Portimao for the next race, we'll just simply have to see how he gets on there. Will there be any improvements? Will he be even further away? We'll have to wait and see.
Now, moving on from a driver who quite a lot of us do have the faith in performing and getting the most out of their car, to a driver who, no offence and no disrespect to him, he has had a good career. He's won Grand Prix. He is in the best car, well, arguably the best car on the grid last season and possibly this season, obviously with Red Bull coming in. Either way, Valtteri Bottas. Chris, since I'm such a nice person, I'm going to give this question to you. Realistically, he crashed with George Russell. There was quite a debate regarding who was at fault and who was where and what space was left. I don't want to talk about this anymore because we've already discussed this through the last few days thoroughly. My question is to Valtteri Bottas, why is he fighting a Williams in the first place? He's in a Mercedes. Hamilton's fighting Max Verstappen for the race win, and Bottas is fighting the second worst car on the grid. What's happened to him? Last year, we saw him win the opening race of the season, and this year he just seems defeated.
It's quite early to say that he seems defeated, but I guess some drivers can take conditions one way or another using their experience, and not like Jake said. I personally don't know enough about Valtteri Bottas's early days, but it did seem like on this particular weekend that something just wasn't clicking regarding punching in the times compared to Verstappen and Hamilton, and he shouldn't really get in a fight with Russell. But in terms of what happened, I in terms of the actual crash, 6 and 1/2 dozen of the other. I don't see anybody's fault in particular on that one. I don't know what anybody else thinks. Jake, what did you think of the crash itself?
Interestingly, I originally thought that it was Bottas at fault because I had looked at the incident on face value and seen that, he had pulled to the middle of the circuit at the last possible minute in order to take his line. But I had assumed it was because he was trying to squeeze Russell out. But if you actually look at the dry part of the circuit and the wet part of the circuit, Bottas was correct in the sense that there was only one dry line at that point of the race. So Russell was trying his luck, but he had confidence and faith in the car and the grip that it could bite. I don't think Bottas was expecting him to be there because at that point in the race, there was only one dry line. So Bottas was correct in his actions. Russell was audacious in his. So I don't think anyone's to blame. I think it was just a pure racing incident that 2 drivers decided they wanted to go for the same bit of track. Russell decided, he wanted to prove himself and go for a move, which was the right call. Bottas was taking his racing line, which was also the right call. It's just unfortunate that Russell got a wheel on the grass and it ended up being the way it is. What was very telling afterwards was Russell's reaction. And I think that's the key factor now that comes out of it. He has now apologized to Bottas, and I think he needed to. He needed to, not because he was at fault, but because it was a moment of weakness in terms of his demeanor. Because we're used to seeing George as this really cool, really awesome, good guy figure that everybody wants to get behind and support. Sakir hurt him. It really hurt him because he had a great chance to show that he was ready to step into the Mercedes seat. And in my opinion, he should have been given it. I'm sorry. I know people are behind the Valtteri Bottas bandwagon. These first 2 races have proved to me it was the wrong call as far as Mercedes are concerned. If they want to beat Red Bull this year that are stronger, they should have gone for George Russell, in my opinion. And it's too late to do anything about it now, unless it isn't. And they decide to be drastic and go, do you know what? It's not working with Valtteri. We'll bring George in, which would, I think, now be counterproductive. I think they should have done it already. But George is clearly feeling the pressure. He's feeling that he's running out of time. He needs to get into that Mercedes seat sooner rather than later. And Mercedes are kind of toying with him a little bit. I think they should have given him the chance this year. I think he'd be on the podium battling away with Lewis. Maybe Lewis was frightened of that. Maybe Mercedes weren't ready to go for their young gun, whatever the reason. But I think they've missed an opportunity. And this incident was a bit of a boiling pot brewing over, that clearly Valtteri and George don't like each other. They are pressured by each other. They're under each other's microscopes, if you will. And George felt he needed to prove himself. Valtteri was just trying to get himself into a good position. Valtteri's on the back foot, but now, because of that incident, so is George.
Yeah, I agree with that one. A few things that were said at the weekend, like George was said, it was not my proudest day, part of his apology. Martin Brundle said that Russell should have seen the bigger picture, arguably, yes. And, of course, Toto said lots to learn after the crash. It does, especially what Toto said, certainly seems to apply pressure on George a bit more.
I think his assessment of it was harsh. I felt what his comments were harsh towards George. You know, he's a racing driver. Of course he's going to go for it. And you can say these things with the benefit of hindsight. But when you're in the car and you're trying to go for a position, you know, we all glorify the Senna adages. If you don't go for a gap that exists, you're no longer a racing driver. George was being a racing driver. That's in his nature. It's in his DNA. Okay, it didn't play out, but I wouldn't say he got it wrong. I would say he was trying to be a racing driver. It didn't work, but is that his fault? Is that something that he needs to be chastised for? I think Toto was very critical and too much.
One thing that I want to add to this part of the conversation, we had the interaction between George Russell and Valtteri Bottas after the crash. We saw George go over to Bottas. He gave him a little cheeky slap on the helmet, and Bottas showed him the finger. We've already mentioned about what that means for George's demeanour, in that he feels like his back's against the ropes, he's up against it. He really needs to show his worth to be in the Mercedes seat for next season. But looking at it from Bottas' point of view, him showing George Russell the finger when he knows that it'll be on TV, it will be broadcast, and you know there is a bit of swearing here and there in Formula One. We know that, but they do try and discourage it where they can. To me, that suggests that Bottas is a man who knows that he's coming to the end of his time at Mercedes. It almost said to me that he doesn't really care too much anymore, especially with his performances in Imola. He was so far off the pace. And it wasn't aided by his efforts in qualifying. He couldn't turn the tyres on. He qualified in, I think it was 8th position, 8th or 9th, somewhere in the bottom reaches of the top 10. And when he had his coming together with George Russell, he flipped him bird. And to me, that just suggested he just doesn't really care that much anymore.
He looked way off the pace in Bahrain. He looked way off the pace in Imola. We have seen it before with Montoya leaving mid-season. Could Bottas throw his toys out the pram and say it's not worth it anymore?
I mean, that's a very tricky question. You're right, we have seen it before with Juan Pablo Montoya back in his McLaren days. In the case of Bottas, don't forget he is in what is arguably the best car on the grid. We could say the Red Bull maybe is in the moment, but Mercedes is still up there. They're still winning races and fighting for podiums. Is Bottas really going to want to give that up when he's in a position that he's in, where he can still win races?
At the same time, he's not the one winning the races, is he? It's Lewis that's winning the races. He's basically being given the same package, and he's not even able to keep up with the teammate that he's worked with for 4 seasons.
Well, he's not currently winning races, no. But don't forget, over the course of the last 4 seasons, since 2017, Bottas has always been the number 2 to Hamilton. He's won races here and there, but he's never really been on his level. And are we really expecting anything to be different with Bottas this season? I don't think so. I think he will still win a race or two here and there. But going back to my point earlier, I just get the impression from him that he feels as though he knows that he's up against a Mercedes. He knows that he might not be there into 2022. And him showing George the middle finger after their crash, yes, it was annoying to George Russell, but more than anything to me, it just says that he almost doesn't care anymore whether he's in it or not. Maybe he knows that he's not going to be there for much longer. Who knows?
Did Valtteri Bottas not say on that Formula 1 Drive to Survive on Netflix that he felt like quitting after one of the races in the season and he had to give way to? So he's obviously felt this way before. He's felt this way before, and he I guess he came to, or whatever it is. What's to say he won't think that way again?
Well, see, I think the difference here is we've had a couple of seasons recently where Bottas has won the season opener, and it's been a fantastic start for him. And, you know, we've had all the famous comments from him that have been repeated multiple times. You know which one I mean. And it's been a good start to the season for him, and that's given him the fire to say, yes, let's go get it, let's do this. And then ultimately he's fallen short time after time. But on this occasion, he's actually started off the season really poorly. He had a bad race in Bahrain. He had a really bad race in Imola. And he hasn't really had that same kick of motivation that he has done in previous seasons. So I think you've raised a very good point there, Chris. He's already felt this way about maybe does he want to be there anymore?
Yeah.
Given that he's had such a bad start to the season, maybe that's compounding his misery a bit further. And I'm not.
And Formula One drivers don't have a lot of patience, do they? I mean, look at Barrichello. He played number 2 to Schumacher for 6 seasons and then said, no, it's not worth it. I'll just go somewhere else where I can actually have a bit of fun racing a car. Massa, number 2 to Alonso for 4 years. I've had enough. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep doing the same thing. Irvine, 4 years, number 2 to Schumacher. The only way I can beat him is in another car. So let's do it. And I think Bottas is getting to that point.
You mentioned a lot of Ferrari drivers in that one. I feel a bit hurt by that.
No, but I suppose I'm using that as an example because there's a team that always seems to have like a clear number 1, number 2 lineage. I know that Mercedes have always said that we don't have a number 1, number 2 policy. The problem is that by nature, Hamilton is the number 1, whether it's in the contract or not. And I'm not saying that because they treat him any differently, because they don't. I'm saying that because Hamilton is just simply better. So he makes himself the number 1 by doing a better job consistently than Valtteri. Now, we're talking hundredths of a second in qualifying last year. This year, the gap is huge by comparison. It's already like half a second at the start of the season. And that tells you a heck of a lot about Bottas's focus, his motivation, his charisma, his determination, his preparation. And I think he's going to run out of patience. I would not at all be surprised if mid-season he goes, do you know what? It ain't worth it.
That also brings us back to the point we made earlier about Sergio Perez. Is it still too early in the season? It's been a really bad start for Bottas for the first 2 races, but it's only the first 2 races. For all we know, he could go on to a dominant victory in Portimao. We just don't really know that yet.
I'm also thinking the same thing about Vettel and Alonso, actually. whether it's worth them whether it's worth them being in the seats they're in.
Well, we mentioned about Vettel and the Aston Martin project in the last podcast, and I feel as though that Aston Martin has been a bit too overhyped, in my opinion. I'm not really surprised that they've had a bit of a subpar start to their season, but they've got time. It's Aston Martin's first season back in Formula One. They don't really need to perform to the top level just yet. But with Bottas, I mentioned this in our Downforce Radio group chat the other day. I don't think that Bottas is going to be with Mercedes into 2022. I think he'll either be a new driver in Russell or maybe 2 new drivers. It also depends on what Hamilton decides to do. I'm of the opinion that if Hamilton wins his 8th title this season, that's when he'll call it a day. And Bottas, I think he's out of Mercedes at the end of the season regardless. So we could potentially go into 22 with a completely new driver lineup at Mercedes. And as you guys have said earlier, if Bottas decides that he wants to leave early, or maybe if he's pushed early, who knows? But wouldn't that be a fantastic story if, like, George Russell, for example, could be drafted into Mercedes mid-season and actually push Hamilton? Because I reckon if George Russell is in the same car as Hamilton, he will push him. I still think Hamilton will probably have the edge between those two, but Russell, I believe, will give him a lot more of a challenge than Bottas has been in the past few years.
Well, just the final topic I'd like to bring up on this subject before we move on is the actual quotation from George Russell after the race. Now, obviously, he has since apologised, but it really just does show that everyone at Mercedes isn't ignoring this scenario. He was talking to Toto Wolff about something. It's not been confirmed what they were talking about at the post-Bahrain photo shoot. And Toto Wolff simply just swiped his hand across his neck and told Bottas to go away. And you take a look at George's words after the race. He said, "I said, are you trying to kill us both? For him, he's in 9th position, which for a Mercedes driver is nothing. He needs to be fighting for victories and podiums every single race. A move like this is like he is fighting on the last lap of the World Championship, not for P9. Realistically, I think that just does show that everyone at Mercedes, including the junior drivers, I'm not sure. I think Frederick Vesti is with Mercedes. I'm not sure if it's all of the junior drivers that are looking at this and licking their lips, but either way, the pressure is on Bottas this season. And if he doesn't perform, he will be out of this Mercedes driver. And with Red Bull, if Perez can pick up the pace, Red Bull do stand a very good chance of winning a Constructors' World title for the first time since 2013. But Jake, moving away from Mercedes and Red Bull now and going back down, looking at the rest of the field, Lando Norris scored his second Formula One podium. Now, there was quite a difference in the way they celebrated. His first podium, he was just going around like mental, and just running around, hugging everyone he possibly could. He was a bit more laid back this time, excited, but not as excited as last time. Either way, McLaren actually got him past Daniel Ricciardo using team orders. Now, there was quite a debate post-race after this, whether this shows that Lando Norris is the number one driver or Daniel Ricciardo isn't fast enough. In my opinion, I wrote this in a feature article for downforceradio.uk. It surely just shows that there is quite a harmonious relationship at McLaren where they give Ricciardo the laps to try and go faster. And if he can't do it, we'll let Lando through, see what he can do. And maybe later in the race, if Lando can't do anything, we'll swap them back over. Do you think that just shows that McLaren has a step up in terms of the harmonious nature in the team?
Absolutely. Yeah, without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, it's funny, the rumours about whether Lando Norris is the number one in the team. I don't read the Daily Express, and certainly I wouldn't even use it for toilet paper, never mind reading matter. So it's interesting. Do you know what? McLaren needed to improve. They needed to move forward. And the way to do that is to be harmonious. They've looked at how other teams have done it, and their format hasn't worked. Ferrari, there was an internal implosion last year and the year before between Leclerc and Vettel. And, you know, Bottas, Hamilton, it still continues to be a rocky road. Verstappen doesn't have a decent relationship with any of his teammates because they're never there long enough to cement anything. McLaren has got a really good vibe and they need to keep that going. But they're basing it on partial history, but also the real team commitment. I've had the privilege of working with McLaren for a week a couple of years ago on their esports project. And everything they do, not just on the Formula One side, but everything they do is about the communication side. It's all about the inter-team relationship. They've really been working on that with Zach Brown coming in. That's very much been his attitude. His mode is people. He is much more a people person than he is a car person. He loves his cars, but he loves the interpersonal relationships he has with people. And that's how he gets things done. It took them a few years to come around from their previous way of working. You've got to remember that people were doubting Zach Brown, you know, in the Alonso Button days. You know, is he the right person for this job? Totally he is, but he's had to completely reprogram McLaren's thinking. The reason the success is coming now is because Zach has completely redirected everything from the ground up. They've completely reinvented themselves, and they're able to get back to winning ways because Zach's modus operandi completely works. It just needed to be a complete revolution of how McLaren works. Lando's comfortable, Daniel's comfortable, and I think he's happy to play the team role if there's a justified reason for it. And there was a justified reason for it. You know, it worked. And both cars were able to get into the top six by the end of the day. That's what McLaren are trying to do more and more often. And both drivers are realists. They know that the Mercedes Red Bull thing is an aspiration. They know it's a dream. So to be able to beat one of their cars is still a tough ask. But they were competitive with them. You know, they're getting close to it. They were close this time, closer than they've ever been, realistically. So I think McLaren are doing an amazing job. Lando and Daniel, as far as I can see, are still equal number ones. It just happened to be that one had a better chance of success than the other. So they utilized it. They were wise. They were sensible. I think this is McLaren's best chance yet of breaking into the top three permanently.
No, going back to the actual matter at hand between Norris and Ricciardo, Norris came over the team radio and said, "I'm faster than Daniel, let me through," or words to that effect. And it wasn't just a simple case of, yeah, let's do it straight away. They did actually give Daniel the chance to up his game and go faster. Ultimately, he wasn't able to go much faster, so he said, okay, let's give Lando a chance up front. Once Lando got past, he then shot off into distance. I think he was like 8 or 10 seconds further up the field after only a handful of laps. So this wasn't just Lando saying, oh yeah, I'm the faster car, let me go. He actually felt so he was faster. And after trying it with Daniel, they did agree. Lando was able to go through, and it resulted in a podium for the team. And any suggestion of, oh, that's just Lando being the number one, no, absolutely not. If it was the other way round, if it was Daniel saying, I'm faster than Lando, and it transpired that that was the case, they would have done the exact same thing there as well. This is where the team aspects of McLaren's really coming into its own, and they're able to now get the results. They've got 2 world-class drivers in their team. Daniel's a proven race winner, 7-time race winner. Lando, he's been on the podium twice now. He's shown his quality all through the junior ranks. They've got one of the best driver lineups in Formula One at the moment, and through them working together as they have been, that is producing results, and that was very evident in Imola. They played the team game. Neither driver was prioritising themselves over the other. They were thinking more in the grand scheme of things for the team, and they came away with some silverware. If they can do that throughout the entire season, then maybe they can go on and get 3rd place in the Constructors again.
I would interject that there was a bit of worry to be put in for Ricciardo at this weekend. But maybe he's just starting out with McLaren, a bit like Perez, just trying to find his feet with McLaren. But you said that he shot off into the distance. I have the figures here. On lap 17, they switched cars. And the gap grew 2.7, 4.2, 6, 7.5. Eventually, Ricciardo was passed by Carlos Sainz. And after 9 laps, since Norris went ahead of Ricciardo, he was 11 seconds ahead. I mean, there's being a bit quicker, and then there is being that. I mean, it's quite a difference. But then, of course, when the race had the red flag and let things to settle, both Norris and Ricciardo went on the same tyre. They went on the C4, the red tyre. The gap between Ricciardo and Sainz, of course, the man who was in front of him, would have been very close because it was the start of the restart. But the gap grew quite considerably from 0.8 at lap 35, 1.5, 2.1, 2.6, 3, 3.2, 3.5. He was on a faster tyre. Norris got himself ahead, strategy-wise, and made it work. Daniel Ricciardo couldn't. And eventually, after the restart, which was 34, so 29 laps of racing, he was 24 seconds behind Sainz and 27.5 behind Lando. That's quite shocking.
I'm going to use the same argument that I used for Perez. Ricciardo did not have that much experience in the European karting scene. He did a few races, but he didn't do much. And I think it's the same deficiency that Perez had, that Ricciardo had in that race, because it was just such
after the restart. The track was dry. The track was dry, and he was still in terms of fastest laps. He was 1.1 seconds slower than Lando. And that was when, and they both set that when they were on their C4s.
I think this is down to pre-season. I mean, you've got to remember that Lando Norris, this is effectively his 19th race with that car. His 18th race with that car. This is Daniel Ricciardo's 2nd. So Lando's been in this car for a year already, so he knows. And Daniel is still learning it. And obviously, with reduced testing time, it's going to take a bit longer to get up to speed with the car. So I think by the time we get to the next 3 races, Daniel's going to be able to prove his class again. I don't think anybody can doubt Daniel's caliber. He's made some interesting decisions in terms of his career, but I think he's still got plenty to show.
I mean, this is only race 2. I do think that the time difference between Lando and Daniel was quite alarming for me anyway, regarding that how he was just dropped by Ferrari. That was the interesting. That they're having this talk about the whole Ferrari McLaren back together in terms of the rivalry. It ain't going to be much of a rivalry if Daniel Ricciardo is going to be that far behind again.
Now, gentlemen, if we just move away from modern Formula One for a second, Jake, can you quickly tell me what date it is, real quick?
So today is April the 21st when we're recording this.
Perfect. Either way, so April the 21st. Did you know, gentlemen, that on this day in 1985, Ayrton Senna won his first Grand Prix?
Yes, I did know that.
Right. Now, the question I have for you, all of you, currently, Topher leads the On This Day championship by half a point. Who finished second, and how far behind were they?
I'm fairly sure that second in the race was Rosberg, and he was about 55 seconds back.
No, it was Alboreto.
Oh, was it Alboreto?
I want to say it was Michele Alboreto, wasn't it? And I think it was a minute. I think it was a minute as well.
I'm with Chris on this one. I think it was Alboreto as well. See, obviously, I have no idea on the gap, but obviously the more high-profile aspect of that race was that it was Ayrton Senna's first ever win.
It's really rather embarrassing because I did actually watch this race on Sky F1 Classics the other day. I should know
I'm
what
confident
happened.
there's Alboreto, and I think it was a minute, if not more than a minute.
I think it's Alboreto. I think it. Yeah.
Okay, so I will give the point for that one to whoever is closest.
Okay, well,
Right.
So if you just want to go in order, say your answer, I will let you know.
in terms of what driver and time.
Yeah, so if you say Chris and then Jake and then Topher.
Okay, Alboreto, and I say over a minute, 1 minute and 1.
Right, okay.
I kind of have to stick with my original answer, even though it's probably wrong. I'm going to say Rosberg, and I think it was 55 seconds.
Right, and Topher?
As I've said, I do agree with Chris that I think it was Alboreto. I'll be more than happy for him to have the points for that because he said it first. As for the gap, I have no idea whatsoever. Chris has already said about a minute, so I'm going to go differently just for competition's sake. I'm going to say half a minute.
Oh, okay. So I can confirm that Chris and Topher will get 1 point each for Michele Alboreto. Chris, you will have the point for the gap. It was 1 minute, 2 seconds, 0.978.
Oh, very close, Chris. But you said a minute, 1 second, didn't you?
Very good.
Yeah. Well, I thought it was over a
Very
minute.
good.
So regarding, just for the sake of saying a number, 1 minute 1.
Well, only 1 second off in the end of it.
So now Chris leads the championship by half a point. Chris, you do know the prize.
Hey, Ferrari are leading something. Yeah.
Prize if you win this championship, don't you?
Oh god. Wooden spoon.
A Cadbury's chocolate bar. So just keep that in mind. Anyway,
It's all to play for.
Oh, well, wait a minute. I did not know a Cadbury's chocolate bar was. I'm going to make much more of an effort now.
Can the champion choose which Cadbury?
of course.
Oh, now that's even more enticing.
Those would be a whisper.
I'm on a budget, okay? Anything under a pound.
Just like a small pack of Maltesers are saying.
Oh, well, that means I can't ask for a box of Astros because you can only get them in South Africa or international candy stores. So that's annoying.
Anyway, gentlemen, back to the serious stuff. Yuki Tsunoda had a very impressive debut in Bahrain. However, the situation in Imola really wasn't as good as he would have hoped. He crashed in qualifying, made his way through the grid up through the Grand Prix. However, towards the end, after the safety car and after the red flag, he actually spun on the exit, I think it was of Tamburello. So, Chris, what do you think about Yuki Tsunoda, and how do you think he performed this weekend in relation to how we expected him to?
Well, he's a rookie. Rookies make rookie mistakes. We saw another rookie do mistakes this race weekend as well, but we'll get to that probably a bit later. But he's a punchy character, and you got to love those, but they wave up and down every now and then, and they can be brilliant, and then they can have that little bit of a shaky incident, like in his qualifying, for example. I mean, he tried. I felt like he tried to do too much and just went off, and he was angry with himself about that, but he collected himself. He, because it was a mistake for that, but then starting at the back. He gained a lot of places in the first few laps, passed his teammate when Gasly was on the really wrong tyres, which was great. And then that sort of was the best of it, really. And then when the race happened again, lap 34, like you said, he spun on his own accord, which is, I think they're just rookie errors. I think that's all you could put it down to. If you say he's done 3 seasons of Formula One, I don't think you'd see the same thing.
And Jake, it seems that every driver who Netflix go to in order to film a Grand Prix with, they either end up crashing out of the race or they end up winning it. It's a really bizarre factor that people have dubbed the Netflix curse. What do you think about that?
What wasn't there like an 80-1 bet that Tsunoda could actually win based on the fact that Netflix were filming him for the weekend or something like that? I don't know if there's. I don't think I believe in curses or anything like that, but I think it's fascinating that, I don't know whether that actually played a hand in it or if it was just coincidence. But unfortunate as it was, I don't think it is anything that Yuki can really have any major concerns about. He's a rookie, he's going to make a rookie mistake. It happens. And I don't think he has to be too disappointed with his lot. He gave it his best. And, he did fight back. He wasn't able to make a massive improvement forward, but then he's in an AlphaTauri. There's only so much you can do with an AlphaTauri at Imola, a circuit which is not easy to overtake on. So I don't think he's got anything to be majorly concerned about. It's one of those things. I think as a newbie to Formula One, you're allowed to make an error here or there. And he's certainly still proving to everybody that he's one to watch.
And Topher, Pierre Gasly at the start of the race was placed onto the wet compound of tyre, whereas most other drivers, I think except the two Haas cars and Esteban Ocon, were both placed on the intermediate tyres. So Gasly made his way through the grid, through the carnage, and then as the track continued to dry, and as it continued to get more and more towards the dry tyres, he just fell further back and further back and further back. Do you think that really cost him a good result, considering he ended the race in, I think it was 7th place after penalties? Do you think he possibly could have even been challenging Ricciardo and the two Ferraris?
That's a big question of what if, really. That's always difficult to answer when you put forward any sort of question like that, because like I said, it's that great question of what if. What if he had started on the intermediates with everyone else? But when it is a wet track like it was in Imola, you're going to get some drivers who do take a bit of a gamble. It might be the decision of the team. It might be the decision of the driver. And in Pierre Gasly's position, you kind of feel as though he doesn't really have anything left to prove. He's already a Grand Prix winner at Monza last season. He's already had a stint with Red Bull. He's done really well with AlphaTauri. He's being touted at moving to another team in 2022. I feel as though he doesn't really have anything left to prove. So why wouldn't you take a gamble like that if it ends up paying dividends? And on this occasion, it didn't. And I think given just how far he was falling back in that race when the track started to dry up, I think he could be more than happy with 7th place after that. It's a great result given just how easily he was being overtaken earlier on in the race. But so if I was in his position, I'm thinking, why not take a gamble? It might get a bit more wet, it might pay off, and he might get on a podium and maybe even win the race again. There's so many questions of what if in Formula One, and on this particular occasion, it just didn't work out for him.
And in contrast, one of their biggest rivals this season, AlphaTauri, have been extremely compared this season to Ferrari. Now, Jake, Ferrari are a team which last year, we touched on this last time in Bahrain, they had a really tough season last year. They're worst since 1980. They've come back, they've fought hard, 4th and 5th. They could be, in contrast to everyone's beliefs, Mattia Binotto said that their minimum goal was 3rd in the championship. They could actually achieve that if McLaren do have a bit of a tumble.
It's looking good, isn't it? Ferrari do seem to have had a bit of a rejuvenation. And I think they've done exactly what we saw from McLaren a few seasons ago. And I said this at the time, there's no point keeping Vettel at Ferrari when you're spending a ridiculous quantity of money on him. You may as well go for a cheaper driver. And ironically, they've done exactly the same thing McLaren did. Get rid of a multiple world champion and get Carlos Sainz in. That's exactly what Ferrari's done. So, do you know what? It's a very sensible decision, because at the end of the day, when there is nothing to choose between the top talents in terms of one lap pace, if you were to put Vettel and Sainz into the same machinery and measure them for one lap pace, I don't think there would be much more than a 1/10 of a second between them, in all honesty. So from Ferrari's point of view, why spend a ludicrous quantity of money every year when you could cash in, save the money, spend it on the car development, and actually make progress? And I think that's exactly what they needed to do. They were in the same place that McLaren were when they had Alonso and Button on board. They were obviously spending a lot of money on the drivers, not enough on the car development, and they couldn't figure out what the problem was. Ferrari have had to eat humble pie and do exactly the same thing, and it makes a lot of sense, which is why I'm slightly baffled as to why, Aston Martin and Alpine have gone down the route of hiring Vettel and Alonso, because they are worth more money than the pace that they're actually bringing to the car, in my opinion. So it's funny. I think Ferrari are going to have a very, very subtle way back. This year, they will quietly get on with the job. They'll have a couple of podiums this year. I genuinely believe that. And next year, they'll be ready for a title assault. This year is about getting themselves back to where they need to be gradually.
Now, Chris, as Jake just touched on, Aston Martin really haven't had the season that they wanted, so far at least. They have only scored a minimum number of points. I think Lance Stroll has finished in both races in the points very strongly, but Sebastian Vettel has really, really struggled. Obviously, the second race in Imola wasn't his fault. They had brake temperature issues. And in your opinion, on the technical side at least, Aston Martin launched a protest to say that they felt that the FIA had done something wrong in terms of the way they implemented these regulations. Do you think that is a fair call for them to make, or do you think they were, in the words of Toto Wolff, just collateral damage for the FIA trying to pin down Mercedes?
The latter. I think this was a rule change. I think everyone saw this rule change. As in, like, at the time they saw it, so they could have done something about it for themselves. They chose not to, and they're paying the price for it. It's how do I put it? It's just collateral damage, and they're just going to have to take it. I mean, when they were threatening to take legal action of it, I thought that was a bit of a reach, I think, because, of course, you can't change aerodynamics, I believe, unless it's on safety grounds. Well, they're not going to, unless something drastic happens, like a rake falling off and hitting a driver in the face, then they're not going to do that. But they're just going to have to take it, and I think they're going to have to work their way around it, because there's no point in trying to fight when there's better things to focus on, to be honest with you.
And once again, Williams had a very strong qualifying session, Topher. It was, I think, their best session since Monza in 2018. Don't quote me on that, but that's the last proper time I remember Williams having both cars right up there in the midfield and not struggling to have any pace for once. But then in the race, Nicholas Latifi, he spun off on lap 1, collided with Nikita Mazepin, and then obviously we touched on earlier the crash with Valtteri Bottas and George Russell. But in your opinion, do you think they really have just thrown away what possibly could be their best chance at scoring points this year?
Well, don't forget, Will, it is still very early on in the season. We still have another, 21 races to go, is it? It's only the second race of the season, and I mean, yeah, it was quite a high-profile crash that happened with George Russell and Bottas. It wasn't really high-profile because it was a Williams. It was high-profile because it was two Mercedes drivers fighting for a very coveted race seat in 2022. With their qualifying performance, I was very impressed by them, and if I remember correctly, Nicholas Latifi, he was P12 in Q2. In Q1, he was P12. He was ahead of George Russell, which I believe is the first time that Latifi has outqualified Russell in any of the practice sessions. I mean, ultimately, Russell did start ahead on the grids because he did better job in Q2, but in Q1, Latifi was the quicker of the two drivers, and that's showing that Latifi's making progress. He's already had some time in the car to get adapted to the demands of Formula One. He's getting integrated into the team. But Russell's always had the measure of him. Latifi, he's been coming on leaps and bounds since he joined Formula One. And you can see this constant improvement from his side. He's been making up that deficit to George Russell, and finally he's been able to get ahead of him in the qualifying session. And just look at my notes here for where he finished the race. Latifi actually didn't finish the race. He was involved in a collision early on. Okay, so it didn't really come to anything for Williams in the end. And going back to your question about is this maybe their best chance of getting some points this season, it was definitely a chance to get points. Obviously, the crash with Bottas didn't exactly help matters, to put it quite lightly. But no, they seem like they've actually managed to get quite on top of things this season. They're in a much better position than they were in previous seasons. The team's been constantly improving over the last few years. They're getting up there. George Russell's been knocking on the door of the top 10 for quite a long time now. So I think that we're definitely going to see Williams in the points at some points this season. I don't know exactly when it's going to be. It could be the next race at Portimao. It could be a bit further on down the line, maybe the season finale in Abu Dhabi. I can't really put any sort of prediction on that. But given how much they have improved over the last few years, and now they've got into a point where they've got a car which can challenge into the midfield, I would not be at all surprised to see them reaching the points at some point.
I will say, if I'm allowed to interject, that I think that although Russell was fighting for ninth place, I believe, and he was sitting in 10th, which is points finishing, I think that he wouldn't have finished in the points because behind him was Giovinazzi and Tsunoda. I think it was Tsunoda who was actually behind him, and then it was Giovinazzi, but both of them were pouring at them hand over fist in the 3 laps prior to the crash. I mean, Tsunoda on lap 28 was 15.2 behind him. On lap 29, it was 10 behind him, and on lap 30, 6 seconds behind him. So I think ultimately, Russell, even if he did get past Bottas, I think he would have been put out of the points position again because of Tsunoda and Giovinazzi. And don't forget, Kimi Räikkönen was also right behind them.
That also brings up the question once again, Chris, of the all of the what ifs of Formula One. What if there wasn't a crash between Bottas and Russell? What would have happened? Maybe Bottas would have slipped further down the order. Maybe George could have even made more progress. But to your point, maybe he could have fallen behind the likes of Tsunoda and Giovinazzi and all that. You just don't really know, do you? It's all hypothetical at this point. The real thing that did happen was obviously the crash between the two took them both out of the race. I think that there was definitely a possibility that George could have finished in a points. Definitely a possibility. He was driving very well up until that point. But yeah, it's all hypothetical when it's all said and done. What's happened has happened.
I think what we can take from it is that Williams are definitely in a more positive place than they have been. And I think it's because the culture has changed to a certain extent within the team. And the reality of it is that the Williams family, everybody loves them, and their dynamicism within the sport, it can't be questioned. We loved having the Williams family there. But I think it's fair to say that their mode of Formula One is outdated. It was just not possible to sustain a Formula One team with their way of thinking anymore, because they were privateers come hell or high water. There were certain things that they would say, we'll do this over our dead body. And unfortunately, with Formula One changing every year, you have to be willing to be a little bit more flexible. You have to be willing to make these certain concessions and to be flexible. And for all of the love we have for the Williams family's passion for the sport, I think that stubborn nature and that, heels in the sand attitude that they had, which again, we love them for, it just didn't really have much of a place left in modern Formula One, which is a shame, because I think the sport is a little bit poorer for not having them be part of it. But the team can now blossom under the new understanding that the team has of the regulations and how they can make it work to their advantage. And you can see immediately that the progress is already being made.
Well, when the team was first acquired by Dorilton Capital, who's now the owners of Williams, my understanding is that one of the caveats that was in the contracts when they bought out the team was that it must stay under the Williams name. They can't rename it at all.
Correct.
Because
correct.
as you said, Jake, they have that heritage behind the team. It's one of the reasons why people love Williams so much. You've got all of this history. You've got Sir Frank Williams starting up the team in the first place back in the 70s. They gave championships to the likes of Alan Jones, Jacques Villeneuve, Damon Hill. And they've become an absolute force within Formula One. I mean, obviously, not so much at the moment, but they still have that massive heritage behind them. And it's one of the reasons why they are so endearing within the world of Formula One. So when Dorilton Capital came on board and took over the team, there was definitely a shift in attitude, especially behind the scenes. They started to look at it in a bit of a different way. And I don't say that to mean that it put a bad light on Claire Williams, because I think she did quite a good job running the team that she had at the time. She took the team to a point where they were fighting for podiums and possible victories back in 2014. And then they went through the decline, and she's been there through all of that. He kind of feels like I kind of got to a point where she maybe felt for herself that she needed to sell the team if it meant giving them a better chance of getting up the order and possibly challenging for victories once again in the future.
Yeah. I mean, let's be frank here. Let's be
Frank
honest.
Williams.
Well, people have said that Claire was not fit to be a team boss of the Williams team, which is completely not true. I think a lot of people take into account that, well, Claire took over from Frank. That's not actually true. She was the deputy team principal, and she ran every major decision that she ran by Frank. They were in it together. She was actually very, very involved with Frank and how they ran the team. So anybody who wants to take a pop at Claire Williams for doing a bad job running the team should direct those comments to Sir Frank Williams. And if Sir Frank was still the public face of the team when they left, I don't think anybody would have dared to take a punt at Sir Frank Williams. But all of those decisions were made with conference and conversation with Sir Frank Williams. So anybody who genuinely feels that Claire Williams did a bad job running the team, you should get off your platform, okay? Because she was instrumental in bringing the team back to greatness with the Martini deal with Mercedes, and she brought them third place in the Constructors' Championship. You can't overrule the fact that she was part of that. She made that happen along with Frank. They had the opportunity to do that. And that actually showed, under new technical regulations, the creative thinking of Williams, it was fabulous because they were one of the first teams to come out of the blocks with a competitive package. What they couldn't do was sustain it. And that's the difficulty. They couldn't sustain it. So I don't want anybody to go away thinking, well, now that Doralton Capital has gone, that Williams can flourish because they've got better people in charge. No, they've got different people in charge. It's a different way of thinking. And unfortunately, the Williams family methodology of running a Formula One team, that time is gone. In the same way that Brabham couldn't have run their team the same way they had done. Lotus couldn't keep up with it. And Williams were very, very brave as a family for hanging on as long as they did, and full credit to them for hanging as long as they did. They lasted 30 years longer than many of their competitors.
There seems to be almost this kind of culture within Formula One, if you like. I mentioned earlier about how we tend to live in the past a bit in Formula One, as in we look back to the good old days. And speaking of Williams, the time when they entered into Formula One and then they were dominant with like Jacques Villeneuve, Damon Hill, Nigel Mansell, all those people. But at the same time, there's also this culture of very much living in the present where, as the saying goes in not just Formula One, but in a lot of sports, you're only as good as your last game. So that could be applied to football, it could be applied to rugby, it could be applied to snooker, and it also very much applies in Formula One, or at least that is the belief of a lot of people who watch it. So you mentioned, Jake, about the fact that Claire Williams brought Williams to third place in the Constructors back in 2014. A lot of people look at that and say, yeah, but that's 7 years ago. What about now? But don't forget, Formula One is a very tough business to be successful in. And when you're a team that doesn't really have the same amount of financial backing as a lot of the front-running teams, so Mercedes, for example, super rich organization. They've got so much money behind them, and it shows in their on-track performance. Williams was still very much a privateer team. They're running off their own back pretty much. They did have their sponsor partners and all that, but not to the same extent as any of the front runners. So for her to put forward that Martini deal back in 2014, get the Mercedes backing as well with the engines, I think the gearboxes back then as well, and get them to a point where they were third in the championship, I'm on your side, Jake, where if anyone does ridicule Claire Williams for the job that she did, like, why? What's the point of ridiculing her? She did a fantastic job with what she had available at the time.
Yeah, she did.
So I don't really see the arguments against her personally. And also, don't forget, the team isn't just about her. There's a whole team of like mechanics, engineers, designers. It's not just about one person. It's the same if you look at a football team. If a football team is performing badly on the pitch, who takes the brunt of the blame? It's the manager. But the manager isn't the one out on the pitch, is he? So it's almost as if there's this blame culture going on. They need to find some sort of scapegoat. And as Williams took that decline, Claire Williams was bearing the brunt of that. And I think to an extent rather unfairly. That's my personal opinion anyway.
Obviously, one team on the grid who currently is performing not how they hoped, just like Williams. Obviously, we just mentioned how they want to get back to the top, but Haas really are in a difficult position. And obviously, we saw that in Bahrain. We saw that Haas were struggling and were not where they were 2 years ago compared to the rest of the grid. But this race just really compounded how poor they were, Chris. 2 laps down past the rest of the field, and that's even with a red flag. I know you've been looking at the lap times, especially in terms of Schumacher, but it's really not what Gunther Stein and Nikita Mazepin or Mick Schumacher want, is it?
No, you don't really need to say any more than that. 2 laps down, even with like a 29 lap, when all the talk of this whole sprint race stuff, 29 laps, you could call that a sprint race. So the 2 laps down after the sprint race, that is, I had to think of a word, atrocious, I think, in some aspects. But I guess that's what saying that you're doing all your development to next year's car says. It sort of seems to be that way. But regarding lap times, it was Schumacher. Yeah, his fastest lap was faster than Daniel Ricciardo's. It was about 0.1 faster Daniel Ricciardo's fastest lap. I know you don't do that all the time, but that's still quite good. But Mazepin's fastest lap was 1.3 slower than Schumacher. 1.3, and he had the little spin at the end, didn't he, as well? So, like, I don't think we can really blame the drivers wholeheartedly. I think it is the car. I know they're rookies going in, diving straight at the deep end. It's just, I think they sort of had this coming in some respects. I don't know what you think, Jake, but I think this is sort of something which they kind of asked for.
I don't know if you could say they asked for it, but certainly it's... look, we're looking at all this very much in early days. We still don't really know what the cars are capable of.
True.
I mean, we've had two races that are very, very different, and Imola didn't really give us a massive indication in terms of the raw pace of the cars, in all honesty. Even in the dry running, these cars are still getting up to speed. And this is a weird year compared to anything else because all of the cars are essentially last year's car. So it's a very, very strange change in the dynamic of the beginning of a Formula One season because we're still trying to figure out who's actually got a competitive package. We know that Mercedes don't have as competitive a package as they had compared to Red Bull last year. And we know that Williams have taken a massive quantum leap forward and Haas aren't doing anything. So it's still a very massive year in terms of the question marks that we're still asking and having answered as each race develops.
One thing that I think I mentioned in the last podcast about Haas was the fact that it seems to be a bit more about the car than the drivers at the moment. And we had the spin for Mazepin on turn 2 of lap 1 in Bahrain. And people on social media, as they like to do, try to find any excuse to have a bit of a dig at Mazepin. But then 2 or 3 laps later, Schumacher goes and spins it as well. And in this particular instance as well in Imola, again, it wasn't just one driver. It wasn't just Mazepin who had a spin. It wasn't just Schumacher who had a spin. Both of them had their offs. Mazepin went off towards the end of the race. Schumacher had his crash into the barrier. To me, what I'm taking away from that is it's not the drivers. They are both capable drivers.
Yeah.
Maybe the car just isn't there. And as Chris mentioned a moment ago, they're looking more towards 2022, which I think ultimately in the long run could pay off. But when you're looking at it now and how they're performing now, clearly it's not good enough for a team that came into Formula One having quite high ambitions. We haven't really had that many American teams in Formula One over the years. And this is a team that came in hoping that in the next few years, they'd be able to build themselves up to be one of the more successful teams, challenge at the front, challenge Mercedes, challenge Ferrari, and so on. It hasn't really been happening for them.
Haas is hilarious in the sense that they have proven that they can do very much with very little. But now, 5 years later, it seems like they've gone the other way. They're doing very little with very much because they've got a little bit more funding that's come in. Thanks to Mick Schumacher and Nikita Mazepin. And what they've done essentially is that, well, we'll put this in place for this year, but we'll just focus everything on 2022. Now, I think they'll manage that because of the funding that comes from the Mazepin family. So I think that'll be all right. But it's the reputation that they will suffer with over 2021. And I'm not talking about anything to do with social media and, all of the criticism that's obviously going to go their way because of we all know what. But just their performance on track is clearly going to be stymied by a dog of a car. I mean, we've seen it in several conditions now. It looks hideous to drive, and neither driver seems to be getting on top of it. And they've had the same amount of test days in that car that every other team has had. It just seems like the worst handling Formula One car of the modern era. And neither Mick or Nikita, no matter how talented they are, can get on top of it. I don't think you could ask any other drivers to get in there and do any better. It's just going to be a really embarrassing season. What's ultimately going to happen is that Gunther Steiner now needs to convince Gene Haas that it's worth continuing this project into 2022. It's about whether or not Gene Haas will continue to see that it's worth seeing what will happen in 2022 or whether he'll pull the plug and sell the team completely.
Well, funny you should mention that, Jake, because actually just today, at the time of recording on Twitter, I'm starting to see reports that the team might be sold. And don't forget, this is just rumour. There's nothing that I've seen that will substantially back the claim.
It wouldn't shock me at all. It wouldn't shock me at all. I mean,
exactly. I was just about to say the same thing.
There's only so much patience that Gene Haas is going to have. Look, he's a winner. Everything he's done, he has won. He has won in IndyCar several times over. He has won in NASCAR several times over. Formula One, he had a great opportunity, and he did a lot with that first car in 2016. That car was impressive right out of the blocks. But so for them to have taken this massive, this absolute car crash of a race team, slumping down to the back of the grid, it doesn't give you any confidence at all. This team has been giant killing in the past. And now they're just looking like a bunch of idiots who don't know what they're doing. Even worse than they were a couple of years ago, famously on Netflix. This is now a shadow of the former team. It would not surprise me at all if Gene Haas goes, do you know what, mate? It's not worth it.
And if he does end up deciding that he doesn't want to continue, this is just if. I can actually imagine a scenario where we might get S&P Racing involved in Formula One. They've already got the Russian link with Nikita Mazepin being in the car, so maybe there could be that.
Mazepin would probably be teammates with Robert Schwartzman next year, almost certainly, or Danny Kvyat if they want experience.
Well, this is what I was about to get onto. They have options as well. There's a few Russian drivers who are coming up through the ranks of junior Formula. I think there's a couple in Formula 3 this season. They could potentially get Danny Kvyat on board as one of their drivers with the experience he has. He's driven for the Red Bull team. He's been a development driver with Ferrari, and he's now the reserve driver for Alpine. So he's getting a lot of experience under his belt, even if it is behind the scenes.
And all of this could, of course, cause problems if they do decide to buy out the team and become SMP Racing because of the WADA scandal. That could become a massive talking point.
Yeah, I had a feeling that you were about to mention that when you started.
Well, we still don't know what's going to happen with the livery, do we? We still don't really know.
From what I heard, I think the WADA actually okayed the livery. Which
they have shut down the investigation.
Yeah, which I'm sort of in two minds about, really, because obviously Nikita Mazepin isn't racing under the Russian flag this season because of all of the doping scandal, which is another story that we won't get into right now. But then Haas very clearly put a Russian flag on their car. They can spin it whatever way they want. I think one of them said that is just the colours they went for. I just think, no, it's clearly a Russian flag to appease your Russian backers.
It doesn't look Russian. What are you on about? It doesn't look Russian whatsoever. It's just red, white, and blue.
To me, the delivery is so basic. I think they're Russian into it.
Terrible that joke.
Okay.
Anyway, back to what I was saying. Like I said, I'm sort of in two minds about the WADA ruling about the delivery because, to me, it is very clear that it is a Russian flag, and if they apply that principle to the use of the nationality, in the case of Mazepin, then they should really apply the same rule to the car as well. But at the same time, I'm also of the opinion of, just get on with the racing. You've got a car, you've got a livery, have at it. Well, it's a lot of faff for the team to go through for something that ultimately the team wasn't actually at all involved in the doping scandal that went on. So in some ways, why should they have to not suffer, but be collateral to that sort of thing when it's nothing to do with them? It's sort of, there's two sides of the coin with that one. But it will be interesting to see what happens to the team over the next season. I'm not saying with absolute I'm not saying with absolute certainty that it will be SMP that takes over the team if Gene Haas decides to sell up. It could be any number of potential buys. We had Panthera Asia F1 knocking on the door of Formula One recently, so maybe they could get involved with the team. There's so many what-ifs. Again, I've said this a few times now. There's so many what-ifs in Formula One. A lot of it, I think, will be dependent on what Gene Haas decides to do. Will he stick with the team, keep it American, keep it Haas, and keep on Mick and Nikita for another season when theoretically their cars should be better? Or does he say, no, I've had enough, I'm off back to NASCAR, and then bring in for example, SMP to come in and buy the team? It's very difficult to know at this moment, and as I've said, it's just a rumour at this point. That's all it is.
It's not the first time that a team has come into F1 going, oh yeah, we're going to be perfectly fine, and then what happens?
Shall we start a list, or do we have time for that?
I don't think we do.
And if all else fails, we always have William Story, who can buy the team and turn it into rich energy.
That's rich coming from you.
Well, see, that's another great joke. Well, you say that, but Rich Energy have actually been propping up in quite a number of places and actually paying their sponsorship bills. So maybe they Yeah, they did actually pay. They sponsored the British Mini Bike Championship. They're now teamed up with British touring car team Power Max Care Car Racing. So there is a good potential that Rich Energy may actually mean what they say. I mean, that sounds funny considering what we had with Haas before, but maybe there is a genuine possibility they're actually going to deliver on what they think they're going to deliver on.
Linked into the rumours about Haas and Gene potentially selling up. I mean, William, from what I've heard, is interested, but that's a whole nother story.
Yeah.
Now.
If it happens, I will actually, even though I hate energy drink, I'll go out there and find some and drink it if it adds it up.
You know what? I've never actually seen Rich Energy in the stores. Nowhere.
They only made like 400
I haven't seen one in the stores. But I want to say that they were primarily to begin with only online sales, I believe. Yeah. But I have had a can of Rich Energy.
What was it like?
Back at the 2019... Well, at the 2019 British Grand Prix, Sam managed to snag me a can of it, Sam Hall, our fellow colleague, while I was in between sessions. And it tasted interesting. Very similar to another energy drink. Let's put it that way.
I have heard on multiple occasions from multiple sources that it does taste indeed very similar to another energy drink.
Well, let's put it this way. There are other energy drinks available. For example. Although not necessarily in one paddock.
Yeah, I've never seen it in any stores anywhere. And I've seen people online posting pictures of it in their hand, like they found on a shelf somewhere. Me personally, I've never seen it anywhere. I'm not massively into energy drinks myself, but it's sort of gotten to a point now where I'm intrigued enough to at least give one can a go just to see what it's like. I suppose you could call that good marketing from William's story if he's getting to a point where people are actually saying, you know what, I actually want to see what it's like now. So is this just one big marketing scheme maybe?
I can tell you from the perspective of a college student who drinks quite a lot of energy drinks to get them through the day. I haven't seen a can of Rich Energy in any stores, and I've got my exams next week. So realistically, I think I would be searching right up and down the shelf to find some. But who knows? If I feel nice, the winner of the On This Day Championship might even get a can of Rich Energy.
No.
It's all to play for now.
I am withdrawing.
Never mind the chocolate bar. You want the Rich Energy, Well, never mind the chocolate.
I'm withdrawing from this. I do not want a can.
Just because I'll have done something not many other people in the world have done. So it's just the uniqueness of it.
Anyway, as we come to the end of the show now, a segment which was actually put forward by Chris, so being nice, I'll make him start. I would like you all to summarise the Grand Prix in 3 words. So let's start with Chris, then Topher, and then we'll save the best till last, Mr. Jake Sanson, as always.
The 3 words I'd say is something's brewing here. The reason why I say that for the race is because, of course, we've had the first race won by Lewis, and the second race has been won by Verstappen. So something is coming through at the same time for 2 races in a row, seeing both Ferrari and McLaren's with each other. So there is something to come from this. That's why I say something. Those are my 3 words.
My turn. Damp, brutal, challenging. Self-explanatory, really.
As for my 3 words, I think I'm probably going to have to go with lots of potential. And that doesn't necessarily just apply to the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. I think it applies to the season that we are potentially in for. We had the titanic battle between Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen in Bahrain. And then we had another battle between them in Imola, where in Bahrain, Verstappen made the mistake of overtaking Hamilton off track, and that put pay to his race. This time around in Imola, Hamilton made the mistake going off the track into the barrier, which put pay to his race. And I kind of feel so. I know it's only 2 races into the season so far, but I don't think I'm alone in saying that I think we are in for an absolutely monumental scrap for the title between those 2. And also further down the field as well, we've got the potential of new teams in Alpine, Aston Martin, for example, the new drivers, Yuki Tsunoda, for example, a lot of potential there. There's so many questions that we have going into the season. Is it going to be Hamilton getting an 8th title? Is it going to be Verstappen winning his first? Are we going to see the emergence of the next Red Bull superstar? How is Mazepin going to get on alongside Schumacher. That's quite a high-profile battle between those two. There's so many what-ifs that are going on in this season. So, as I said, lots of potential, and that is lots of potential for an absolutely mega season.
And because this is most likely, fingers crossed, hopefully going to be one of the best seasons that we've seen, possibly even since 2012, the three words that I would use to round up the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix is F1 is back. Now, thank you very much, the three of you, for joining me in today's episode of Maximum Downforce, the official Formula One podcast for Downforce Radio. And thank you very much to all of you who are listening at home. If you want to go and check out any of the other episodes from this series, just go onto Spotify, iTunes, you name it, we're on it. If you want to go and check out our social media, it's at Downforce Radio, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you want to go and listen to our radio station, or even give some of the articles on our website a read, it is downforceradio.uk. I'll say that one more time, downforceradio.uk. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you are all staying very well, and good night.